Hello and welcome. Thank you all for coming along to the 9th in a series of disaster recovery conversations brought to you by the Victorian Council of Social Service. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from where I'm presenting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and of course those emerging leaders. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, which has generously provided the funding to allow this conversation to take place. Next, I'd like to introduce Georgia Knight and Taryn Coswello, who you'll see on your screen, and they're our Auslan interpreters for today. And thank you. Just a reminder, we are recording today and we'll be transcribing the conversation so that you can share it across your networks. If you've got any questions for your speakers, please submit them on the tab on your screen. I'm very excited today to be introducing to you some of the new resources and tools that are available for community organisations in and around disasters, disaster resilience and disaster recovery. This is a really important part of our overall bushfire recovery project. And of course, the work that community organisations do, not only every day, but importantly do during disasters. My first speaker today is Tanya de Michele. Tanya is from Volunteering Victoria and joined in August last year. Tanya's working on projects to support volunteer engagement through COVID-19. In her previous life, Tanya managed various projects and programs to support better mental health and to provide families with disability better access to services within their family. Tanya also spent a number of years managing CFA's volunteer peer support program. So I think what's great about Tanya is she really understands both sides. Tanya is passionate about contributing and continuing to make a contribution to support disadvantaged groups within the community. And I think her work at Volunteering Victoria is a fantastic extension of that. Tanya, I'm really pleased to welcome you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about weVolunteer.
Thank you, Bridget. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about the work that Volunteering Victoria is doing in the community recovery space. I'd like to start now just with talking a bit about weVolunteer and how it started. So as Bridget mentioned, I started in August last year, and it was around that time that weVolunteer was launched by the Premier of Victoria. It was done in response to the growing social impacts of the pandemic and the need to, at the time, mobilise volunteers to support local communities. weVolunteer is designed to help build community resilience and aid social recovery through volunteering. At the time, it started as a pilot, and since then it has now been funded for an additional 12 months. So we have funding as a program until the end of June next year. So I guess while it started as a response to the pandemic, looking into the future, most recently, the Inspector General for Emergency Management issued a report into the inquiry of the 2019 fires, and it was specifically mentioned in that volunteering is an important part of supporting community recovery in local communities. It went further to talk specifically about weVolunteer and the importance that a platform such as weVolunteer can have on actually coordinating spontaneous volunteers and mobilising them on the ground in the immediate aftermath of a disaster to support community recovery. So on that note, I will move on to what our current aims are for weVolunteer. So essentially we have 4 key aims, and we like to refer to them as the 4 Ps. The first one being the pool. So it's our aim to have a dedicated volunteer pool, a community of volunteers that are ready to help when the need is present within local communities. We currently have more than 2,400 volunteers registered across the state, and they're all specifically registered because they want to support community recovery in their local communities. We continuously engage with this group of volunteers by sharing newsletters with them and various other initiatives to, I guess, set them up so that they're part of a network and feel like they can have an impact within their community. There's then the passport. So when a volunteer signs up, they also register to have a volunteer passport. And this particular passport empowers volunteers to have their own portable volunteering record. It gives them the opportunity to have skills and certifications verified. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. There's also preparedness. So while we have the pool and the passport as important components of weVolunteer, it's our aim that we actually support the organisations and volunteers by preparing them for community recovery initiatives and to support in those times of need. Earlier this year, we ran some training, some of which was delivered by Red Cross Australia, as well as some of our own training. We covered areas on how to support others in crisis, self-care, COVID-safe volunteering, and making sure that organisations are supported to work with the national standards of volunteering. And then finally, there's place. And in some ways, this goes hand in hand with preparedness because it's really about collaborating and building those networks with local communities, but also with local government, emergency management organisations, volunteer involving organisations and volunteer support organisations. So as I mentioned, there's a volunteer passport that each volunteer has, and we're quite proud of this passport because it is a first for Australia. It's powered by MyPass. So MyPass is our technology provider as part of weVolunteer. So the passport is designed to save time and effort, which otherwise would be spent manually managing volunteer applications, certifications, and different information through the recruitment process. There's also the verification of credentials. This is actually done by MyPass. They have a team that makes sure that any documents uploaded are actually valid and current. So things like working with children checks, first aid certificates, police checks, anything that might be relevant to a volunteer role or what an organisation might need. And finally, the volunteer passport, it really empowers volunteers to own their information and to share it with the organisations that they wish to volunteer with. So there's the privacy aspects that only information that they share will be available and be able to be viewed by the organisations. Alongside the passport is the portal, which is also part of the MyPass technology, and this is specifically for organisations. So when an organisation registers with weVolunteer, they receive access to their very own portal, and that it provides them with detailed data and a history of roles and volunteer engagement as they continue to use the portal and make use of weVolunteer. It gives them the ability to communicate new roles as well as connect with volunteers that agree to provide their information to the organisation. So you can really create your own network, share roles that are specifically related to community recovery, and then have access to those volunteer passports so that you can actually see there and then the details and certifications that a volunteer might have to support your organisation and the local community. So the technology aspect of weVolunteer is really important, but it's not the only part of weVolunteer. In fact, this is probably one of the most significant aspects of weVolunteer, and an important part of the program is the wraparound services that the weVolunteer team provides. So we want to make sure that no one feels uncomfortable with using the technology. Not everyone out there is technically savvy, even in this day and age where I'm talking to you on a screen. But the technology itself is an important part of it, but we have a team that actually assists with that. So there is as much or as little help as an organisation might need to navigate both the portal, but it's not only that, it's also around supporting you with knowing what information to put in a role so that you attract the right volunteers, supporting with preparing position descriptions, and it might also extend further, given Volunteering Victoria is the peak body for volunteering in Victoria, is information and advice to support volunteering that's safe and supports your organisation moving forward. So how does it work? If an organisation would like to register with weVolunteer, it's as simple as going to our website, so wevolunteer.org.au, and on that website you can enter some details, because we do need to make sure that organisations have valid volunteer insurance and that you fit within the criteria in terms of supporting community recovery, and I'll go into a bit more detail about that soon. So once you're registered and our team verifies your details, you then get access to your portal, and that's when you can upload roles to the portal. Our team then shares those roles usually via a role sharing email, but sometimes there are other methods that are used. And then from there, volunteers will express interest in the role. If they're interested, they'll share their passport with you. And that's when you can actually review and screen applications in your portal. You can then take those details and complete your normal onboarding process as you would normally do. So weVolunteer, there are a few things that it is and a few things that it isn't. So essentially it really is about providing a rapid response in times of need. And it is specifically focused on community recovery and resilience. And because of that, the idea is that it complements existing platforms and tools rather than replacing them. And most importantly, it's free. So it's free for volunteers and it's free for volunteer involving organisations. It's not a volunteer management system. So as I mentioned, it complements existing platforms and tools. And it's not just a recruitment platform. It also doesn't support roles that are part of usual business operations. So it really does need to have that community recovery focus. So the registration criteria, as I mentioned, when an organisation expresses interest and wants to register with weVolunteer, there's a few things that we check. Firstly, an organisation needs to either be not-for-profit, government or for-purpose. There needs to be valid volunteer insurance. And the organisation needs to require volunteers for an urgent or important community need. And that could also include a difficulty in sourcing volunteers. So what do we mean by community recovery? weVolunteer, as a team, what we've done is we've defined community recovery around the roles that we see as fitting within that criteria. So there's 4 categories that we've identified that fit within the community recovery space. The first one is essential services. So things like disaster relief, cleanup, food relief, driving, transportation, a lot of those roles that you often see as being needed in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, or even as we've seen during the pandemic now, particularly around food relief, those sorts of roles fit into essential services. There's then social support, so anything within the mental health, disability, aged care space, welfare checks, companionship, and this is obviously extremely important at the moment as we're moving out of lockdown and moving forward into Victoria's long-term recovery, that this wellbeing support is provided for our local communities. There's also community projects, so it might be things like fundraising or events that support community recovery at the local level. And sometimes the roles will require specialist skills, whether that be logistics, operations, IT, finance, that fits into that criteria. So I think probably the best way to actually give a clear picture of what weVolunteer is about is to give a real life example. And this particular example, Muslim Women's Council of Victoria approached us late last year. They had an initiative that they'd started up during the pandemic, which was Friday free meals. And they had a number of volunteers in place to prepare the meals and pack the meals, but they were struggling to get anyone to be able to deliver the meals. So they approached us and we were able to determine what their needs were and worked closely with them to set up a portal. Afshan, the council president, who's pictured there, she was not, I don't think she'll mind me saying that she was not someone that was technically savvy, so to speak. We provided her support in that process and was able to then share a role with the pool for a volunteer driver. And from that first call with Afshan to the time that they were able to interview and place volunteers, that was all done within a 24-hour period. So Afshan was able to get on board 2 volunteer drivers. They're still with the organisation today. And I guess that gives a sense of the immediate response that can happen and the quick turnaround to mobilising volunteers and getting them out to where they're needed most. I'm actually coming to the end of my presentation now. So the contact details for weVolunteer are there on the screen. We have a 1-800 number. And as I mentioned, registering with weVolunteer is as simple as going to our website there. I'd encourage any and all organisations that are in the community recovery space to join. And like I said, we can support as much or as little as you like, and it really is the perfect opportunity to get on board before or as we're heading into fire season 2, as a way of preparing we obviously hope that there are no disasters in the immediate future, but there's always a need for volunteers, and we're moving into a community recovery phase now, as I'm sure everyone can imagine, moving out of lockdown in Victoria. It's the perfect time to get on board and give us a call or see how we can help. Thank you for your time.
Wow, thank you so much, Tanya. That was such a comprehensive overview. I almost feel like I just want to go diving in and taking a look. What I really like about this program is the way you've combined, the power of technology and the amazing things that that programs and platforms can do, but also combining that with a level of support and that kind of human contact. Can you tell us a little bit about that support that you provide for people that might not have the level of sort of digital literacy required?
Sure. So we've got an amazing team behind the scenes who works really closely with the organisations. So it starts right from the point of when they express their interest to register. Contact is made with the organisation, a discussion is had to understand what their needs are and how we can support them. They then have an opportunity to be walked through the portal and how to use it. We often give them a chance to have a go and try it out first. And then from then on, it's a matter of we have someone in our team who does regular check-ins with the organisations who are registered, making sure that checking in to see if they've got any roles that are coming up, working with them to determine what they might need to get volunteers to support, and just being available whenever is needed. So we have the 1-800 number. We also have the email service, and basically there's no issue too big or little that we will make sure that we can support as much as we can. And if needed, we actually will, help by uploading roles and those sorts of things if there's a real barrier in terms of using the technology.
Absolutely. I like the way you can support people by walking them through the process, so you're actually helping them to develop their digital skills, which is fantastic. Tanya, we know that volunteer numbers plummeted really during the early stages of the pandemic and right through last year. Are you starting to see those volunteers coming back?
Look, it is going to be a slow process, I think. We've certainly got quite a bit of interest with volunteers signing up and engaging with weVolunteer. So as I mentioned before, we've got over 2,400 registered, and that keeps increasing as we move forward. Where we're seeing, I guess, it's a slow pace in getting because the organisations have experienced a lot of setbacks with the lockdowns, that it's meant that it's difficult for them to now get back and look at what roles they might need or how they might engage volunteers. So we, I suppose at Volunteering Victoria, there's a lot of work going into how we can support organisations to build their capacity to also support different ways of volunteering. So maybe it's about engaging volunteers just for short periods of time. A lot of people out there don't seem to have the time that they used to. The traditional volunteering of sticking with one organisation and volunteering a certain amount of hours per month is not something that is as common anymore. So it's about looking at other ways, and that's where weVolunteer provides that flexible volunteering where there is potential for a volunteer to just donate or give a few hours of their time to one organisation and to another just to help when it's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can imagine that as the world returns to some sort of semblance of normal, I know people are stopping and taking stock of their lives, of how they work, and I imagine there'll be that flow-on effect into the volunteering sector for some time to come. And we know that volunteers are such an essential part of our fabric. They are so vital to delivering a range of services and programs from all sectors, from sport to the arts to the emergency services, and to the community sector in particular. And what they do is work to build and strengthen communities every single day, and their contribution is just so valuable. So really anything we can do to support volunteers and volunteering is a fabulous thing, and I think this weVolunteer is a really fabulous model. Tanya, did you have any last minute thoughts or reflections that you'd like to share?
I guess just taking what you've just said then, volunteering is so important to community recovery. And, while we've seen a decline in volunteering, it's really going hand in hand to support that volunteer re-engagement as well as supporting those local communities. So it's a win-win from my point of view. So the more organisations that we can get on board, the better, so we can connect the volunteers, the organisations to their local communities.
Absolutely. Well, I'm hoping your phone 1-800 number will be running hot tomorrow, Tanya. Here's hoping. Tanya de Michele, thank you so much for sharing and letting us know about weVolunteer today. A huge congratulations to Volunteering Victoria, an extraordinary piece of work, and built and delivered in the midst of a global pandemic. Really, really extraordinary. And I certainly hope that the funding is continued well beyond the 12 months, because I can really see how a program like this could be expanded out into your day-to-day volunteering as well as this emergency volunteering. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Welcome back. I'm really pleased now to introduce our next speaker, Emily Anderson. Emily is a consultant with over 18 years of experience in working across the community, health and environmental sectors. She has extensive experience in rural and regional communities, including roles with land care, local government, primary care partnerships, and a range of not-for-profits. Emily has an in-depth understanding of fostering partnerships, building consensus, and embracing diversity and inclusion. Emily currently works with for-purpose organisations to engage their communities, create partnerships, and build their capacity to grow and thrive. Of course, Emily's most important role has been with VCOSS over the past 18 months, working on our bushfire recovery project, of which these disaster recovery conversations are one component. Emily, welcome.
Thank you, Bridget. What a beautiful introduction, and I really appreciate those words. And hello to everybody out there today. It's an honour to present today, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So today I'm talking about a stakeholder guide that we're producing at VCOSS to really targeted for community organisations to try and address some of those issues around, well, the big issues around the confusion and the complexity that often goes hand in hand with emergency management, or really disaster recovery and response after a disaster hits, particularly when there's a lot of chaos and there's a lot happening, and there are a lot of players coming in and out with varying roles. And it can be very difficult to understand who everybody is and what they do. So this guide aims to really explain some of the stakeholders out there, cover a little bit about emergency management, dip into social recovery, and outline many of the different stakeholders involved in social recovery. So first of all, I just wanted to stop and recognise that it's a bit of a stormy day in Victoria for all of us. And there's certainly some thunder here earlier, and potentially some hailstorms happening. And I just wanted to recognise that I'm feeling a little bit anxious about it myself and a little bit worried. Having been through a disaster, like many of you, the recent bushfires, when thunder happens or storms happen, particularly thunder, that it does bring back those memories. And it certainly happens with my son, who we had to pick up from school this afternoon, just because he's very scared of thunder since experiencing those bushfires and the storms that fires self-generate. So I just wanted to take a moment to say I'm thinking about everyone who's feeling that way. Also thinking about farmers out there who have crops and their livelihoods out there in the paddock. I come from southwest Victoria on a broadacre cropping farm near the Grampians. We've got some beautiful looking crops out there and a lot of developing seed. So fingers crossed that we get to harvest without too many storm problems. Okay, I also wanted to recognise the amazing work that so many of you are doing out there in the community sector and the emergency management sector every day in your roles, helping to support your communities. You're doing an absolutely fabulous job through very challenging times. Yes, so I really wanted to recognise that and acknowledge everything that you do. So I'll dip now into the stakeholder guide and I'll go through this presentation. Please do feel free to add any questions in the chat, and I'll certainly try and address those at the end. So the aim of the guide is really for community organisations. That's who it's targeted for, to identify the different disaster recovery stakeholders and processes, particularly in the social sphere of disaster recovery, to better understand the various roles and responsibilities in social recovery, and then to confidently explore how they may be able to contribute to disaster recovery, what role they can best play, and how they may look to collaborate with some of these major players within disaster recovery. They can then be more part of recovery efforts right from the outset, can build partnerships before disasters happen. So people are familiar with the people in the community leaders and the different community organisations that are already out there who are already doing some great work with their communities and can really add value during a recovery process. It's also a bit of a starting point to provide some information on the services out there, what they do, and a bit of a director, and also to really increase the recognition of the community sector in disaster recovery. So I guess the main aim is to really build confidence within community organisations to say, oh, I do get this emergency management sector. I do understand a bit about the process and I do understand some of the players. So I can confidently go forward and look for opportunities, whether it be being involved in a local community recovery committee, whether it be talking to their local government about how they can contribute, or whether it be talking to some of those other broader stakeholders like Bushfire Recovery Victoria or the different departments, or some other philanthropic funders perhaps, about initiatives that they'd like to drive themselves. So this need, I'm hoping many of you can relate to this, because this came really from some of our engagement work last year with community organisations, that they're often in this vacuum after a disaster. There's an increased demand for their services. They often provide a natural local hub for people to gather and to come in and find support and information. There's often high impact on staff who may have experienced a disaster personally, and volunteers and their operations already. Even just operating after an emergency can be incredibly difficult. And there's also this, I guess, pressure from others or from outside of shared responsibility in disaster recovery, of wanting to engage a community-led approach, and often an influx of external players that are unfamiliar and who have different roles that can be tricky to really get across. Well, just clicking through. A couple of quotes that came from some of the work. Getting the initial information out was okay through the Shire, but across the board there were lots of changes and the players and contacts were always shifting. There's just a lack of consistency, period, as everyone tried to understand what was happening and how to cope. And most importantly, and this is the most important thing, community organisations have so much to give and to offer with their local connections, their local knowledge, their local skills, capability, and their people. So it's really about building them to better understand the system and work both ways. So essentially it's a document or something you can look at on the internet, PDF document. It'd be great to have a PowerPoint as well. We'll see what we can do. And it covers some essential sections. So it covers recovery in emergencies and disasters and some of the language and key themes in recovery. It covers a little bit about emergency management, the different phases and plans and approaches. It identifies, helps to lay out and how to identify the existing strengths within your own community and how you can tap into those and really strengthen those long term. And then it canvasses some of the really key formal stakeholders, the recovery and their roles, and many other important stakeholders in recovery and what they do. So in the emergency management section, there's a little bit around the different plans and strategies, the state emergency management priorities, and the 4 phases of emergency management that many of you will understand, but many of us in the community sector might be quite new to. So prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. There's also a great link to a terrific glossary, which covers a lot of the emergency management terms and acronyms, which I've covered there. So that looks at the state emergency management plan, regional emergency management plans, and of course the local municipal emergency management plans, where a lot of the information for local communities and how the emergency management process is planned and should roll out will be contained in those local municipal emergency management plans. It really mainly focuses on social recovery because that's really the sector that I guess VCOSS works in and that we're most interested in around people and wellbeing. This is a diagram from the BRV, Bushfire Recovery Victoria's recovery framework, and some of the different things that are canvassed in the guide. What is community focused recovery? What does that mean? And how does that apply to me? The National Principles for Disaster Recovery, Community Recovery Committees, and how they are often planned and rolled out, and how they can look differently depending on what community is focused on. There's a section in there, and this is the most important thing, I think, around really recognising the strengths within your own community. And so many community organisations do this so well. They already are doing this very well. So it canvasses things like, for example, local community organisations like neighbourhood houses or community centres, local disability organisations, Aboriginal controlled organisations or cooperatives, your local hospital or community health service. Perhaps you have a bush nursing centre nearby. There's often a multicultural organisation or council or a division of a local government that has knowledge around multicultural communities. There's those services providing services to family, children, youth groups, youth programs, different senior activities and aged care facilities. There's often a local housing provider at the local setting, and there may be a range of different social justice organisations and charities. So of course that may be a local Salvation Army, St Vincent de Paul, or of course some of your local groups like Rotary and Lions, and many others. So in the guide, there's also the formal recovery stakeholders. So these are the stakeholders that have a legislative responsibility in an emergency in the social recovery space. So it has a bit of a diagram trying to lay that out. This is just a simplified version, and a table with all of the different roles, with links to the State Emergency Management Plan, which has a lot more detailed information in there. So, for example, the different state government departments are covered: Bushfire Recovery Victoria, for-purpose organisations such as Red Cross, Salvation Army and Vic Food Bank, local government, Vic State Services, so those are like the police, ambulance, the SES, and I've said ambulance, CFA, of course, and the Fire Rescue Victoria, Emergency Management Victoria, and the Inspector General of Emergency Management. So those types of roles are covered briefly. It then goes on to unpack some of the other social recovery stakeholders that aren't often given the limelight, I guess, or recognised for everything that they do after a disaster hits a community. So different philanthropics, peak bodies. There are many of universities in this space doing some amazing research. Family, children and youth organisations, social justice organisations, and family violence organisations, just to name a few. So this guide really tries to focus on some of the key stakeholders. It won't cover all of them, but we'll certainly have examples so that you can think about, okay, so who might this be in my local or regional community, and who might I knock on the door with, give a call or email to connect with them so that we can collaborate going forward. Throughout the guide, I call them bells and whistles. I hope they are. So there's different tips about how you may collaborate or how you may use this information. There's some fantastic quotes from those who we've interviewed in the emergency management space around the guide, and how community organisations can engage with them. So that will be included as well. Some great quotes and information there. And also many links to tools and resources. It's really a summary, this guide, and there's so many fantastic resources and tips and tools out there that we can utilise depending on what you're looking for. So a few of those are flagged and certainly pointed to where you can get more information and help. We've also utilised our case studies that have been put out through VCOSS with the Bushfire Recovery Project. There's some wonderful case studies out there, and some of those have also been included in the guide just to bring it to life and put some examples out there of what some different community organisations are doing and who they're partnered up with to create bigger and better outcomes for their communities at a local level. This is an example of Gippsland Disability Advocacy's program, and how they've used local advocacy peers to work with local groups and emergency managers in developing different emergency management plans in case an emergency happens, with some wonderful and varied local partners. So this is where we're at the moment. So initially we did quite a bit of scoping and research, initial consultation with the sector. We've got a wonderful project advisory group who provided some great feedback. We've then just had a focus group session this week where we've got some terrific participants providing great insight, and I've got some more work to do on the guide to really pull it together and try and make it the best it can be, and really targeted for what community organisations are looking for. So the next thing is for me to please reach out to you. I would really love your feedback. The draft guide will be out the second week of November, and it will go out to the Bushfire Recovery Bulletin list. It will also go out to anybody who is a part of our current networks, and anybody who emails me and says, hey, I'd really love to have a look over that. I'll put your name on the register and ensure you get a copy to look over. Our aim is to have it complete and launched in December, end of November, December. So it'd be wonderful to have your feedback on it. We really want to make sure we get it right for you. We want to make sure it hits the spot and that it's really practical to use in the sector. There are a couple of other things I wanted to mention as well. I've got notes here somewhere. So who's the guide for? I've got a few more minutes, so I'll just tease out a little bit more. So the guide is really for community organisations at the local level who are wanting to get involved in social recovery to contribute to the wellbeing of their communities and to contribute to the recovery effort. So it really can be used by any organisation wanting to know more about this space, but it's particularly targeted to community organisations and community organisations working at that local level. It's really important to us that we have the voice of community organisations in this and in shaping this, because that's exactly who it is for. I also want to stress that it's not a service directory. There's some other great tools and links which perform that function. One of that actually is called Recovery Connect, and I'll ask Kieran to share that on chat, because that's a fabulous initiative by the federal government aiming to, it's like a search database aiming to connect you with the different services at a particular time during a particular disaster. So I do encourage you to explore that. So this is really just a canvassing of the stakeholders and a little bit of an explanation of the system of recovery and who the main players are. The other thing that's important is that, yes, these things can go out of date very quickly. So what we aim to do with this is update it as regularly as we can through VCOSS. There's always government reforms and changes, and players will come and go, of course. So we'll aim to update it when we can, and certainly provide links to websites that will have updated information. So it's important that if you're not sure when you pick it up, if a little bit of time has elapsed since it's been published, that you call VCOSS and just check, are these still the current players? Are these still the current roles? And VCOSS can point you in the right direction and update you. But also, equally, if there are some big changes for you and your organisation, that you let VCOSS know so we can keep things as current as we can. So that's all from me. Thanks again for the opportunity. We would love your feedback on that, and do contact me if you have any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily. We've got a couple of comments coming through saying, great job, can't wait to see it. This should be available right across Australia. And of course, it's a Victorian guide. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to go into every state and territory and unpack their systems and arrangements. That would be quite an overwhelming task. Emily, so it's not a how-to guide, it's more a who's who, is that right?
Exactly, Yes, so there's some other resources and great tools and work that's been done by many other organisations on how to do recovery, particularly at that community level. So it does point to some of those tools for more information, but it's really just, I shouldn't say just because it's not just, but it's essentially who's who and what do they do.
Fantastic. Well, really looking forward to that being finalised and published and getting it out and about. Thank you, Emily. I've got one last question for you, and this relates to, I guess, all of your work that you've done for VCOSS over the past 18 months or so in the bushfire recovery space. And what for you is the biggest thing that you've learnt throughout this process in terms of community organisations and disaster recovery?
Oh, could have given me a heads up on that one. I think, oh, look, just how passionate people are at that local level. You know, disasters deeply impact people, and I think that community organisations, they're in such a unique space, and they have such valuable local knowledge and connections and abilities to share, and the local leaders that are connected to local organisations. They are, you know, the fabric and living and breathing pulse of that local community. And the more that we can connect with community organisations and their local leaders and really listen to their stories and learn, then the better off the whole sector will be.
What a wonderful answer, Emily, and I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but I did that deliberately because I knew you would speak from the heart, and I think you've absolutely encapsulated certainly what VCOSS sees and knows about the role of community organisations in disasters. Emily, thank you so much for your presentation and your work on the guide. For everybody listening, please feel free to contact Emily if you've got any thoughts or ideas about how to improve or add to the guide. I know she'd be keen to hear from you. We're going to have a very short break so that you can hop up and stretch your legs. I don't know about everybody else, but I feel like my rear end is getting very large this year and I feel the need to get up and move. Go and grab a glass of water or a cuppa and come back in a couple of minutes' time. We will be talking about the Disaster Recovery Outcomes Framework, which is a new project being developed by VCOSS, a very, very exciting project, and I know you're going to want to hear about it. We'll see you soon. Thanks. Welcome back, everybody. What a great jaunty little video explaining weVolunteer. Very lovely. I'm really pleased to introduce our next small panel of speakers. We have 3 speakers that are going to be talking to us today about the new Disaster Recovery Outcomes Framework for community organisations. As we've discovered throughout this disaster recovery conversation series and throughout the previous 10 years of work that VCOSS has been undertaking in the emergency management space, we're really aware of the role that community organisations play in disaster resilience, the roles that they play before a disaster, during a disaster, and importantly, during that long period of recovery following a disaster. One of the things about community organisations, and I think this was highlighted in Emily's guide earlier, is that while community organisations play an important role, this isn't a formal role, and therefore it's not necessarily recognised or deeply understood across the broader emergency management sector. One of the things that VCOSS has been trying to do is to articulate that value that community organisations bring, the hard work, the connections, the trust, and the relationships that they have within the disaster recovery space. So as part of this, we thought about developing a tool, an online tool for community organisations to be able to use that would really help them clearly articulate and measure their contribution to disaster recovery. We've since been working with Elaine Hendrick, who I'll introduce you to in just a moment, and a range of community organisations to help develop this tool. This tool has been developed very closely with them in mind, with, by and for community organisations. Everything in the framework reflects the experiences of community organisations that have been through disasters and recovery, that understand the role that they play, that are able to articulate the place they have within their communities. Enough about me. I'm going to introduce our speakers who are going to tell you more about the outcomes framework, starting with Elaine Hendrick. Elaine is an outcome measurement and evaluation specialist with more than 25 years of experience working across not-for-profit, government and non-government sectors in Australia and Singapore. Elaine is a specialist consultant member of the X Factor Collective and is the director and principal consultant of Elaine Hendrick Consulting. Elaine is going to speak first, and then we're going to throw over to our next speakers, who I will introduce now, just so we don't have too much confusion. We'll also be hearing from Kris Newton. Kris is manager at the Mountains Community Resource Network in the Blue Mountains outside of Sydney. Kris is a passionate advocate for the role of community organisations in emergencies and disasters, and since her experiences in the 2013 Blue Mountain bushfires, Kris and the network have provided a wide range of emergency resources for organisations and communities, and continues to advocate for the role of community organisations. We'll also be joined by Dr. Kathleen Brasher, who is the Executive Officer of the Upper Hume Primary Care Partnership. Kathleen is highly experienced in the community sector and is also experienced in outcomes measurement and how it can lead to meaningful and sustained change. In addition, Kathleen is the author of An Age-Friendly Approach to Disaster Recovery, which we featured in an earlier edition of our disaster recovery bulletins and one of our conversations. I'd like to welcome Elaine initially, who's going to tell us a bit more about what is an outcomes framework. Thanks, Elaine.
Thanks, Bridget, for the introduction. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm dialing in from the Wurundjeri Nation, the land on which I live, work, and play. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, for they hold the traditions, cultures, memories, and hopes of Indigenous Australia. Let's imagine we're at the 2022 Australian Disaster Resilience Conference, and we're at its networking event. You walk up to a group, introduce yourself, and begin a conversation. Then someone asks, what was your organization's role in the recent bushfire event? And you say, we provided community with the support they needed during the recovery phase. What if you could say, my organization provided communities with services that address their unique and diverse local contexts and needs? And you have the evidence to show that this was achieved. And when putting a grant submission, your organization is able to confidently say that 85% of community members receiving services during recovery reported that their initial emerging and changing needs were identified and met by the services your organization provided. Well, this is what the Victorian Disaster Recovery Outcomes Framework is all about. It will provide the sector with the ability to tell its success stories through an outcomes lens. I'm thrilled to be given this opportunity today to share the Victorian Disaster Recovery Outcomes Framework for community organizations. Some of you have already been a part of this journey, and to those of you who have been with us from the start of the project, we thank you for your inputs. We could not have done this without the generous sharing of your stories and experiences. The project started in April this year with the establishment of a 10-member co-design working group comprising community organizations that put their hands up to play a role in guiding the design and development of the framework. In May, June, inputs were sought from the sector through 5 workshops and a survey. A total of 96 sector players participated in the development phase. We have taken and ensured, as Bridget had said, a 4-sector by sector approach, and the voices of community organizations have been front and center. So what is the Victorian Disaster Recovery Outcomes Framework for community organizations? It is the first of its kind resource, unlike all the other work being done in the disaster recovery and resilience space, which has mostly been top-down. This framework takes a bottom-up approach. Collaboratively developed, the framework will help community organizations to link what they do best with the why they do what they do, the impact and the desired outcomes. Here's a glimpse of what's to come when the framework is finalized. With sector input, and that has been a really important part of this process, we now have clarity on the why the sector does what it does. The sector impact statement, which is the little bubble in the middle, says inclusive, resilient, and safe communities. The workshops highlighted 6 broad themes, and these themes are access to services for all, adaptive and flexible responses to needs, empowered communities, collaborative partnerships, informed decision-making, capable and effective disaster recovery community organization sector. And out of these 6 themes, 6 high-level outcomes emerged. Communities have appropriate, inclusive, equitable, responsive, accessible services. Communities' initial, emerging, and changing needs are met. Communities leading their recovery. Communities' recovery guided by integrated, coordinated, collaborative, place-based approaches. Effective communication and sector-wide information sharing. And community organizations are resilient and sustainable. The framework ensures that the achievement of outcomes and impact can be measured, monitored, and evaluated, and creates the space for continuous improvement conversations with sector players and key stakeholders. When finalized, sitting alongside the framework will be a monitoring toolkit to assist with data collection and reporting, as well as a user-friendly guide on how to use the framework. The outcomes framework will bring about a shift from collecting and reporting on output data to measuring against sector-wide identified outcomes. It will assist community organizations to describe and measure their contribution to emergency and disaster recovery and the difference that they're making in their communities. So what are the benefits? The framework will provide the sector with shared outcomes and a common language. It will also allow the sector to showcase through the evidence it collects the pivotal role it plays in supporting and connecting communities to build long-term community resilience, allows other stakeholders to have a better understanding of the role of community organizations in disaster recovery, to be recognized and validated for the work it does, and to be supported and funded to do more good work with individuals and communities. What's next? That's the exciting bit. Prior to the launch of the framework in April 2022, it will be tested by identified community organizations. Validation will also be sought from emergency management and disaster recovery stakeholders as part of the process. It is exciting to know that this framework is reflective of the work already being done in the sector. It is very much aligned to the national principles of disaster recovery, and we are extremely excited, and I can't wait to share in April next year the final framework, the guide, and the toolkit. You'll be hearing more about the project's progress in the coming months. That's all from me. Thank you for your time. I'll hand you over now to Kris and Kathleen.
So I'm coming to you from the gorgeous country of the Gundungurra and Darug peoples in the Blue Mountains. I'm thrilled to have been involved in both of these projects, the guide that Em explained to you earlier and this outcomes framework. Having been involved in recovery since 2013 bushfires in the mountains. One of the difficulties that we've faced is, well, for most of the community sector after 2013, we were effectively thrown feet first into the deep end of emergency management. We were ignorant. I mean, we obviously understood that there were emergency services such as the Rural Fire Service in New South Wales and police, fire and rescue, ambulance, the SES and so on. But we had no idea of the formal management system, emergency management system, and Em's guide is going to be a blessing, because when you are thrust into recovery, the last thing you need is a 300-page document to wade through to try and explain to you what you've just fallen into. So I'm thrilled about that. In terms of the outcomes framework, I think this is one of the most exciting projects I've been involved in around recovery, and I share Elaine's excitement about this. Part of the difficulty that we face as place-based organisations is demonstrating to, whether that be government or philanthropics or other grant providers, what exactly is the need identified and what exactly are the outcomes that we're achieving to meet that need, whatever that need might be. We do know that every disaster brings a surge of need, whether that's homelessness services, emergency financial support, domestic violence, alcohol and other drugs, mental health in particular. And being able to articulate what's required to support our local community in a way that demonstrates that we've achieved the outcomes is going to be such a boon for the sector, not just for Victoria, but for the country overall, I think. one of the projects that we're involved in the mountains at the moment with the sector is trying to demonstrate the surge in need over the last 2 years in all of those areas I just mentioned as a result of COVID, not just as a result of the bushfires and the floods and the other cascading disasters that we've suffered. So the ability to do that is so circumscribed at the moment that I've got a project asking our local services to give us their calendar year 2018, 2019, 2020 and eventually 2021 data, not additional data, just whatever it is that they report to their funding body. I'm calling data mining, to try and be able to demonstrate the surge in demand that community services have faced, and where the gaps in government support and funding are. So I think that will be a real benefit of this particular project in terms of outcomes. The other one, obviously, is in being able to demonstrate to funding bodies, grantees, philanthropics, government, what outcomes we've actually achieved as a result of the grant funding. And that's going to be, again, a tremendous boon. Governments, while recognising the value of community services and the value that they play in a community-led recovery, find anything other than output measurement often very difficult. So they want to know how many people turned up to the event, how many people heard about the event or the activity or the service via social media, for example. But they struggle, as we have to date, to actually put any kind of data around the outcomes. And I think that's where this project is so exciting for the sector. So I know that Kathleen has other ideas on this from her perspective, so I'll hand over to Kathleen now.
Thanks. Additional ideas, I'd say, rather than other. I think one of the joys of working on this project has been the great sense of camaraderie and shared interest with those on the co-design working group. I think for me, the real benefit of an outcomes framework is that it lays bare the system that we're working in, and it asks us to get very clear about what our role is in that, and what are the tasks we're doing to provide the outcome that we're all seeking. As Elaine said, that vision of inclusive, safe and resilient communities. It's often very hard to really be crisp in talking about what we do. We all have a very strong sense of the why, but the what can be quite complex, particularly in that immediate post-disaster period, and even for some time afterwards, when you've got that cacophony of noises and people coming in from outside your community, a whole lot of organisations trying to come together, all with every good intention, and sometimes what's happening to the community can actually get a bit lost in that. So I think the outcomes framework will give us that chance to work together across a regional area, to really understand who's doing what, to have those conversations even before a disaster strikes, because this framework will give us the tool really to do that, as well as help us monitor our performance, and to do that in a really positive way, to be able to turn to our staff, to our peers, to our community, and ask how we're going on the measures that we know matter because they're in the framework. So having that ability to monitor what we're doing in a straightforward way that gets at the heart of our work, I think is a really it's a fantastic opportunity for us. And as Kris has already said, it's not something that's done very often. We think about recording outputs, and the really tough thing is to talk about how well we're doing this work, and our members of our community benefiting from the hard work that we're all putting in, and how can we justify and defend the work that we're doing. And I think this outcomes framework is going to be a fantastic contribution from VCOSS to allow us to do that.
Kieran? Wonderful. Thank you to Elaine, Kris and Kathleen. I hope they're going to pop back on the screen because I've got a couple of questions for them. One of the things from my perspective that's been really exciting about this project is that we didn't come to it with a whole series of outcomes or goals that were based on existing emergency management experiences or frameworks or guides or strategies. So we didn't actually come to the group with an expectation of, hey, here's a series of outcomes that we know through research and experience are what communities need, so such as the National Principles for Disaster Recovery. We actually put all of those to one side. And we asked community organisations, tell us about the work that you do in disaster recovery. What does your work look like? Who do you work with and how do you work? And through that information and that intelligence and those insights and reflections, what was really fascinating for me and for all of us involved was that what really came through in terms of the themes, and Elaine touched on this earlier, was that so many of those themes really did actually reflect those national principles and a whole range of other work that of course sits within the emergency management sector as being best practice or good practice in disaster recovery. So that was a really fabulous and exciting moment when we came to that realization, and then when we actually brought in some of those frameworks and guides and strategies and so forth to say, hey, look, everybody, these actually match and fit. There was a real great deal of excitement, but it's very much still about the work that we've done being owned by community organisations, in community organisations' own words, and for this outcomes framework to be developed for a really practical purpose, I think, for community organisations. So one of the questions I've got for you, Elaine, is what's been your key finding around the role of community organisations in disaster recovery? What has really stood out to you?
Well, I came into this project as someone who didn't know anything about the sector. But in this short period of time, I have learned a lot from the sector. So it has been an amazing experience. One of the things that I'm getting from the sector, just from the workshops and having worked with the co-design working group, is that it's an amazing sector that is committed and dedicated, right? And the sharing that we got from the workshops was just amazing. You know, everyone was so open, and like Bridget said, with all the inputs that we got, that is in the current working draft of the framework, came from the sector. We use their language. So their voices run right through it. But yes, it's been such an amazing journey, and I just can't wait for us to finish it and share it with the whole sector. Because I know for a fact from my experience of working with organizations from different industries, how having an outcomes framework can make a huge difference to the work that these organizations do. And it's a way of, like I said, a way of having a common language, you know, so the whole sector speaks the same language. And also then being driven by shared outcomes, you know, and those shared outcomes are all around communities and individuals, and basically that's why we do what we do. It's to make the lives of these individuals and communities better. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Elaine. And I'll just reflect, I think all of the organisations that have participated in this, almost 100 organisations, the vast majority have experience of working in disaster recovery. Of course, they're deeply connected to their communities. They've got strong networks and relationships with community members. So this is very much a community framework, if you like, in that respect. And certainly what came through in all of the workshops and the surveys and the co-design that's been taking place has been very people-centred and community-centred. And I think that's what's one of the things that's really lovely about this outcomes framework, and I know will absolutely resonate across the emergency management sector more broadly. Kris, I'm just thinking back to the Blue Mountains bushfires and your experiences, and if you'd had a tool like this throughout that early recovery period, and I guess into the years following, what sort of a difference do you think having something like this would have made to your organisation?
So as the peak and chairing the Health and Wellbeing Recovery Subcommittee for the Recovery back in 2013, not only was the emergency management foreign territory for us, the formal system, but we were clearly foreign territory to the emergency management system, I think it would be fair to say. I don't think there was a very clear understanding of what it was that community sector organisations actually do on the ground. They struggled even to understand the breadth of community sector organisations, as both Em and Elaine have indicated. You know, youth sector organisations, neighbourhood houses, DV services, homelessness. So, you know, there's such a breadth of the sector. So from a very personal level, my biggest frustration was turning up to the twice weekly, to start with, recovery meetings and trying to explain what it was that the Health and Wellbeing Recovery Committee was doing and what sort of outcomes we were anticipating and then getting from that work. Anecdotally, we ended up having to draw a flow chart so that they had any idea of what it was that was going on in the ground. An outcomes framework like this would have enabled us right from the beginning to identify the key outcomes that community was looking for in recovery, but also the contribution that each of the community sector organisations locally was making to that outcome. And the partnerships that we had, not just with community sector organisations, but with local Department of Health, Department of Education, the PHN, you know, what we call FIFO workers, the people who come in for a short period of time on contract and help with the recovery work. It would have made that collaboration so much more seamless, I think. So, I can't wait.
Thank you, Kris. I love your enthusiasm. I think one of the things that will be really exciting too is sort of matching the framework with what we know around the trajectory of recovery. So in those early phases, you know, the strong need for financial, you know, counselling and support, legal support and so forth, as people are grappling with things like rebuilding and insurance claims and so forth, through to some of those longer term trends that we start to see, where there might be increases in drug and alcohol abuse, risks of family violence and so forth. So if we can actually start to match those together, we can really make sure that we're meeting the needs of communities as needs emerge. Kathleen, a question for you around collecting data and reporting. It's not a favourite thing of community organisations necessarily, often see it as a sort of a have to do. How can we encourage community organisations to consider using this framework in a positive light?
I think it's because the framework will help them. I think all of us are keen to collect data when it's meaningful, when it's purposeful. Collecting data just because you have to fill in boxes is always the last task for a Friday afternoon. But when you see that this matters because it's allowing you to show how you're performing against something that is deeply meaningful for your community. You know, I think there's an excitement about being able to do that, and there will be anxiety and hesitation. Are we going to be judged? Are we up to a standard? What is the standard? You know, so that it will come with that, because it's really hard to say I'm doing the best I can, and is that good enough? It's a really tough ask. And I think, you know, Elaine's ability, I think, to make the language of the tool accessible and to provide that support material behind it, how to use it, will be very helpful. But I think the data will matter to us, because answering the questions about are we doing the job we're here to do matters to us.
Yeah, look, absolutely, Kathleen, and communities, you know, rely on the services of community organisations on a day-to-day basis, but of course never more than when there's a disaster or an emergency. And not only do you have your existing clients, but you'll often have a whole series of new clients and new people coming through, often people who've never accessed the service system before, and I think to be able to be really responsive to their needs, and building on all of the experience that you and your organisations and all of the other organisations that we've developed this with bring to that. And we know that once people have, or organisations have been through a disaster or an emergency, that there's certainly a real drive to want to do better, to learn from what we've done, and to also support other community organisations that may be facing this in the future. And this is very much what we're hoping this tool is for those organisations that might not think a disaster's ever going to hit, and of course one day it will. And with climate change as well, we're only going to be expecting more and more, and of course the last 2 years has really shown that. A huge thank you. Were there any last reflections on the outcomes framework from any one of you there?
Well, I was going to say that once it's out and ready in April, I recommend that everybody jumps on board. And the way to do that is to start small. Because it doesn't matter where you start, as long as you start looking at the work that you do through the lens of outcome, and being able to measure it. Yeah, so that's my tip for the day.
Absolutely. Jump in, have a play, give it a go, and see what happens. VCOSS will also, of course, be providing support to organisations. We'll probably run some webinars with a bit of a how-to, and hopefully walk organisations through the process of discovering this exciting new tool. Thank you so much to our three panellists presenting the outcomes framework for VCOSS and for the Bushfire Recovery Project. And of course, it is a framework for the entire sector. I'm so sorry, that was the biggest clap of thunder. We have come to the end of our disaster recovery conversation for October. If I could just extend a big thank you to Tanya, to Emily, to Elaine, Kris and Kathleen for making time to share in their expertise, their experience and their insights into disaster recovery. A huge thank you to our Auslan interpreters for helping to make this event accessible. And thank you again to Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation for their generous funding. And finally, thank you all for attending. We hope to hear from you soon. And we look forward to seeing you at the next VCOSS Disaster Recovery Conversation, which will sadly be our last in this series. We'll be exploring longer term recovery, what to expect, some of the trends, and hopefully give you some tips and tricks to get through it. Thank you for today. Apologies for my jumping out of my chair with that lightning and thunder, and we'll see you all very soon. Good night.